You know what the other side is counting on this time around? They're counting on you staying home. They're counting on your silence. They're counting on amnesia. They're betting on your apathy, especially because a lot of you are young folks. You've got to prove them wrong. Let's show Washington one more time. Change doesn't come from the top. It doesn't come from millions of dollars of special interest funded attack ads. Change happens from the bottom up.
Whoa, well, you'd be forgiven for thinking that was 2008, not 2010. But the president there at his best, doing his effort to reach out to the base. After so much snark from the White House towards its critics on the left, can he pull the party back together to fight? Clearly he's trying. He's ratcheting up his tone, says the New York Times. But according to polling, it may be too little too late. Our next guest argues that the Obama crew needed to listen better to the doctor, Dr. Dean. But there's still hope if you know where to look. Nation contributor Ari Berman's the author of a brand new book, Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. And we're joined from Washington, D.C. by Democratic consultant and strategist Karen Finney, who knows this from the inside. She served as Director of Communications at the Democratic National Committee. All right, Ari, to you first. The news of the weekend is this talk of, well, Obama's been ratcheting up the talk, riling up the base, but it may be too late. You've got 74% of Tea Party type candidates saying they're geared up to vote, but only about a third of Democrats.
Yeah. Well, Obama, well, first thing, thanks for having me, Laura.
Welcome.
And Obama is clearly trying to get his mojo back, and he's looking at the same polls that we're looking at, and he's saying, what can I do differently? And I think the interesting thing in terms of how he got in this position is that he had this incredible grassroots political movement that you know all about that came up through his campaign, that I argue in the book really came up first through the Dean campaign, was expanded when Howard Dean did his 50-state strategy, and then kind of segued into the Obama campaign. But the interesting thing is that grassroots political movement didn't really translate to the White House. And I think part of the reason it didn't translate is because it wasn't a priority for the White House when they got in there. They ran on this new politics, this new political playbook, but they kind of reverted back to the old playbook. And they surrounded themselves with a lot of very conventional Washington characters, and it made it hard to give the grassroots organizers and activists a sense of ownership. And so I think people felt disconnected. Then the Tea Parties came on, ratcheted it up, and now Obama's saying, I need to play catch-up here, where he was the one who was really supposed to define this debate from the beginning.
Well, let me ask you about that, Karen. I mean, I talked to you in the 2006 race. That's what the Dean campaign was all about, from the bottom up, the 50-state strategy. What did happen to it?
Well, I think actually what happened was a couple of things. One, I think they realized that when you're governing, it's a lot harder to have that same kind of feel of a grassroots organization. Because remember, during the campaign, the whole thing about the internet is it's two-way communication and people can be very engaged. That's a lot harder to replicate in the White House for a variety of reasons. I can tell you from being there myself, between the technological challenges and some of the other, the challenges in terms of how political you can be. I think they tried to replicate it actually at the DNC through OFA at the DNC. And Organizing for America. And, but there again, you have two cultures that they're trying to blend, one being the Organizing for America culture of people who came from organizing for Obama, and then also the DNC, where you have some rank and file Democrats who have, been carrying the party banner for a very long time. And I'm not so sure they anticipated what that challenge was really going to be.
Just remind us, Ari, what was so significant about the Dean campaign, first in 2004 and then his role at DNC, such that you put Dean heart and center of this book of yours?
Yeah, well, I really think the Dean campaign was the first campaign of the 21st century. The amount of innovation that came up through that campaign, it looked nothing like the Gore campaign or the Bush campaign in 2000. So it really was a new frontier. Dean really challenged the Democratic Party to get back to its roots as a party of the people and lower the playing field in terms of the barriers for entry for regular people to get back involved in the political process. So the amount of money that he was able to raise from small donations, the way he was able to get people to organize in new ways. I think all of that served as a template for the Obama campaign. And the interesting thing is, even after Dean's campaign crashed and burned in Iowa and everyone thought he was done, he took those tools, built on them, and then became chair of the party, basically bypassing the traditional Washington establishment, who did not want him to be chair, but he was able to harness these new organizers and activists and get in there.
Now, there were a lot of people who thought, well, with the success in 2006 and the midterms of that 50-state strategy, that Dean would be rewarded mightily in the years to come. And then they looked at what happened in 2008 after the Obama election and said, what happened to him?
Well, you may remember that Governor Dean didn't pick, but found himself in a rather large fight with Rahm Emanuel when Rahm was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Rahm wanted Dean to give him a bunch of money, essentially how it had always been done. Dean said, no, I want to spend the money on the 50-state strategy. You know, I'm going to do my thing, you're going to do your thing, it'll blend well together. You
want to come in on that, Karen? Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly how that went down, Ari. The difference was that what Governor Dean wanted to do, we were building the 50-state strategy, but he said, let's invest the money in the things that will help us win now and in 2008. And he didn't believe that expensive television advertising was the way to go. He thought that grassroots, the ground game, was really where he wanted to make the investment because, again, he felt if you do that now, that actually is going to reap benefits going forward. And Rahm really believed in television advertising. And look, I think the other reality is just their personalities just did not mix very well.
But of course, Rahm, Karen makes a good point in terms of explaining it, but of course, Rahm becomes chief of staff and is really head of the White House. And I don't think he really wanted anything to do with Dean after that. And I think the broader point is not about Dean versus Rahm. It's about the fact that Dean symbolized a link to the grassroots and a key segment of the party base. And by pushing him aside, I think they needlessly alienated some of these core activists that could have been involved in the administration.
Well, skipping up to the present, now you've got, well, Ed Gillespie of the State Leadership Committee on the Republican side saying, we've got all the heat on our side, we've got the 50-state strategy. Here he is talking this weekend.
We've got 19 million people who voted in Republican primaries this past year versus 15 million in Democratic primaries. 4 million more people voted in Republican primaries than in Democrat primaries. That's the first time, I think, since FDR, Republicans have outpaced Democrats in primary voting. That's a very good harbinger for what's going to come on November 2nd. So the fact is there are some growing pains that are going on here with these new folks coming into the political process, coming into the Republican Party primary. But growing pains are better than shrinking pains. And as a former RNC chairman, I'd rather see that any day. And so the fact is, the best thing for us is that these folks are voting in Republican primaries, not backing third-party candidates, Tea Party candidates as a third party.
Coming to you, Karen, on this, I mean, is it overly simplifying things to say now the 50-state strategy is on the GOP side?
Well, absolutely. I mean, number one, Gillespie is making the point there about the number of Republican primary voters, but let's remember that is a civil war within the Republican primary where you had Tea Party activists voting against the establishment Republican candidates. So that's not really an accurate way to frame what happened in the primaries because it's not as if 19 million Republican voters came out and voted against Democrats. And I think that's an important difference because we don't know what's going to happen, frankly, in the general election because I think a lot of the moderate Republican voters are really going to have to ask themselves if they really want to vote for Sharon Engel. And I don't think many of them are actually going to want to do that. But I will say, you've heard Republicans saying for some time that they wanted to replicate the elements of the 50-state strategy. And, one of the most important of those being, one of the pieces of that Governor Dean said is that it's a permanent campaign. You've always got to be running a campaign. You've always got to be engaging your grassroots, engaging people in the states, because it's not just about presidential elections or midterm elections. One of the biggest issues we're going to be facing soon is redistricting, and who controls state legislatures will matter a lot. So it's really having a bigger vision. That I think they actually wanted to kind of take that idea back and try to do a better job mobilizing.
Well, we'll get to that, I hope, before the close. But Ari, before we do, sticking with Gillespie for a second, there is an interesting part at the end of your book where you've got Howard Dean kind of wondering about the Democratic majority. Yeah. And is the party stronger having a larger majority but with sort of red state Democrats by name only, defecting from Democratic agenda, or would they be better with a smaller majority that was more reliable? I'm wondering, looking ahead, would you say to Ed Gillespie, watch out, you're going to have have some serious issues here.
Yeah, when he said growing pains, sort of be careful what you wish for, because this is something that Dean, when I interviewed him, was wrestling with, which is a sense they elected a very large majority. They had no choice in some of these districts but to elect conservatives. But once they've been in Congress, some of these conservative Democrats, they've really blocked the Obama agenda and also wired it down to the point where some of it has become somewhat meaningless. And so I think what Dean's saying is he told me you had to elect these people and then change the party once you got them in there, because it was hard to only change it in the wilderness. He tried to do that too, and he felt like you had to get power to change some of this stuff. I think he did change some of it for the better, but there's still an ongoing process. It's an ongoing fight. And I think the interesting thing now is for progressives and for Democrats to figure out, okay, we got back to the majority. Now can we take it a step further and elect better Democrats in some of these places? And I think that's one of the things they're wrestling with, and that's one of the things Republicans, when they get a bunch of Tea Party people in there, are going to be wrestling with.
Karen, quickly, would the Democrats be better off with a smaller but tougher majority?
No, I think Democrats are better off when they do what Howard Dean said and stand up and be Democrats and stop running away and trying to spin things that they've done or not done to try to suit the electorate that they're facing. What I find so incredible is that time and again, polls show that people on all sides of the political debate want leaders who will stand up and take action and stand up for their principles. And why we don't do that?
Ari, in the USA Today polling today, you've got something like 60% of Americans saying they want more government action to help people in need.
Yeah.
A much smaller number of, I think, 1 out of 5 saying something like government's too big.
Obama hasn't articulated that case, I don't think, effectively enough. He hasn't made an affirmative case for the power of government to help people and shown every day how he's doing that. And in the vacuum, the Tea Parties came up and they made an anti-government case, and the left didn't counter that, or the Obama White House didn't counter that.
Well, I have a book coming out to talk about exactly that. Talk about what's happening in Texas very quickly. Interesting change
Sure.
there.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that's going on, which started with Dean, and I think the Obama people are kind of trying to continue it, is look at the next frontier of political campaigns. And Texas is clearly the place to do that, with the demographics and everything like that changing. And I think a hopeful sign is that I think the Obama people are trying to mobilize supporters there. You're seeing it in the governor's race, but this is just building a foundation to say in 2010, 2016, 2020, if we can get Texas, man, it's over for the Republicans. That is very, very difficult.
That's California.
Yeah. If you can get New York, Texas, and California for Democrats, that's a pretty strong electoral college base to start with.
There's a lot more in your book and a lot more to think about on this topic. Of course, not just for the next few weeks, but in an ongoing way. Karen, thanks so much for joining us. Talk to you again very soon, I hope. Ari Berman's new book, Herding Donkeys, has a link at our website, GRITtv.org. He's also a contributor to The Nation magazine, which partners with us on this program Mondays, and you can find his writing right there at thenation.com. Thanks.